It was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Today, however, the First World War has been mostly forgotten by many, and much of what is remembered isn't even true. It's believed by many that the US remained entirely neutral in the war up until 1917. While it is true that America was neutral on paper, in reality, the country was always more closely aligned with the Allied powers of Britain, France, and Russia. Before the US signed up to fight, many Americans joined the French Foreign Legion so they could fight in the war themselves. Others founded a volunteer ambulance service in Paris, and some sent food aid to Belgium. Meanwhile, German atrocities received a great deal of bad press in the US throughout the war, swinging public opinion toward the Allies. President Woodrow Wilson's neutral stance played an important role in his electoral campaign, and he famously proclaimed that the US must be neutral in fact as well as in name. But America's announcement of neutrality hardly mattered in the end, because the US ended up bankrolling the Allies anyway. To begin with, the choice to provide more money and arms to Britain and France than to the Central Powers was not deliberate. The British naval blockade simply made it difficult for America to trade with Germany. Nevertheless, Wall Street bankers such as J.P. Morgan ended up furnishing Britain with enormous loans, which unintentionally turned the U.S. into a critical ally for Britain. While the blockade continued, a steady stream of American-made goods and guns increasingly made their way into the Allies' hands. Particularly in the United Kingdom, the most famous World War I generals are often associated with incompetence, cowardice, and cruelty. People tend to imagine military leaders telling soldiers to walk unprotected into enemy machine gun fire.
Doing precisely what we've done 18 times before is exactly the last thing they'll expect us to do this time.
While it's true that some battles were ineptly fought, in general, the Allied commanders thought a great deal about how to avoid battlefield massacres. The speed of changing technology, not stupidity, should be blamed for the high death tolls of World War I. Both sides began using artillery and machine guns on a vast scale for the first time, and at the beginning of the war, it wasn't obvious what either side could do about it. The new technology ground the conflict to a bloody halt and made crossing no man's land nigh on impossible. Old-fashioned tactics such as cavalry charges suddenly became obsolete, and the militaries involved struggled to adapt in good time. Generals such as Britain's Field Marshal Douglas Haig encouraged radical technological and tactical changes to surmount these problems, and over 4 years, the very nature of warfare changed. Tanks and planes were tested and perfected, while artillery became more accurate and deadly. Towards the end of the war, the Allies began winning scores of battles thanks to their ability to innovate. It's also worth noting that many generals actually fought on the front lines rather than lounging in offices miles away. In fact, roughly 18% of Britain's generals were wounded or killed in battle. There is a common misconception that the sinking of the Lusitania acted as a breaking point for the US, resulting in the country's entry into the conflict. In reality, although the attack on the Lusitania caused significant outrage stateside, it was sunk by the Germans several years before the US joined the war. A second, less well-known sinking actually brought the US even closer to war. In 1916, the Germans blew up the ocean liner Sussex in the English Channel, wounding several Americans and causing a brief crisis. Even then, President Woodrow Wilson managed to negotiate with the Germans to maintain diplomatic relations. Wilson continued to hold off even when Germany began recklessly attacking naval traffic again in 1917. The final straw arrived in the form of the Zimmermann telegram in early 1917. This secret communication was intercepted by the British Secret Service and provided evidence that despite attempts to maintain the peace, Germany posed an existential threat to the US. In the letter, Germany offered to back the Mexican government if they attacked America, urging them to reclaim large swaths of the American South.
We make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together.
To the delight of the beleaguered British, the contents of the telegram deeply shocked Americans. The US declared war less than a month after the news reached American newspapers. The First World War was no doubt a global war, but despite what you might think, it wasn't the first. In fact, there is a good case to be made that at least 4 world wars have taken place in the last 3 centuries. The real First World War was arguably the 7 Years' War, which was fought from 1756 to 1763. Just like in World War I, European colonies were dragged into a monumental showdown between France, Britain, Spain, and a host of other European nations. The conflict spread across Europe, the Caribbean, North America, and India, laying waste to populations who really had no vested interest in the fighting. Then, in the late 18th century, Napoleon began a world war that involved almost every nation in Europe. It even helped spark the North American War of 1812. The conflict spilled over into Ottoman colonies in the Middle East, such as Egypt and Syria, while the great powers chased each other across the globe. Although neither the 7 Years' War nor the Napoleonic Wars eclipsed the First World War in terms of scale, their impact on global history should not be underestimated. Even today, it's believed by many that in the early days of the war, citizens of the countries involved enthusiastically signed up to fight. This myth is mainly the result of wartime propaganda and censorship. Although many were keen to project a united front, there were widespread protests against the war across the globe. At the beginning of the war, Britain's enormous empire made it possible to avoid implementing a draft, and the cheerful recruits who signed up later became a symbol of gung-ho enthusiasm for the war. However, even before conscription was introduced, large sections of society voiced their objections to a conflict that made little sense to them. London played host to anti-war demonstrations, particularly from left-wing groups and trade unions who used strikes to voice their discontent. In the US, on the other hand, draconian measures were implemented with lightning speed to silence any objections to the war. Around 2,000 Americans were arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which criminalized anything that could be categorized as unpatriotic dissent. Printed materials that criticized US involvement in the war were banned altogether, creating the illusion of a unified nation. As in the UK, socialist groups stood very much against the war, and they were joined by people from all walks of life, including prominent businessmen such as Andrew Carnegie. The protagonists in most blockbuster World War I films tend to be both uniformly white and either Europeans or Americans.
Good luck! And may God be with all of you!
This, unsurprisingly, might give you a rather skewed image of the soldiers who fought in the war. However, millions of non-Europeans were also enlisted to fight the war to end all wars. Roughly 100 countries were involved in the war to some degree, largely thanks to European colonialism. The biggest single contribution from a colony on the Allied side came from British India, which supplied over 1 million Indian soldiers and civilians. Although they are scarcely remembered today, thousands of soldiers were awarded a warm greeting in France at the time with cheers of Vive les Hindous, and quite a few Indian soldiers won Britain's highest honor for valor, the Victoria Cross. A further 2.5 million soldiers were called up from all over Africa by both sides, and around 10,000 Jamaican soldiers signed up, along with citizens from elsewhere in the Caribbean. A host of other nations that seemingly had no reason to get involved also showed their support in various forms. Toward the end of the war, Thailand and Siam sent 1,300 pilots and merchants to the Allies, while Brazil declared war on Germany. When you think of World War I, you probably think of the grinding trench warfare that took place on the Western Front, but many other regions saw pitched battles as well, some of which are more well-known than others. For example, a remarkable amount of fighting took place in Africa. The British and French invaded the German colony then known as Togoland, fought pitched battles in Cameroon, and engaged in several standoffs in Mozambique and the Congo. South Africa was heavily involved on the Allies' side too, and did their best to drive out their German neighbors. By the end of the war, almost 45,000 Kenyan soldiers had died fighting for the British. Many smaller conflicts also occurred in some unlikely places. In late 1914, for example, a major battle took place in China because the Germans controlled the city of Qingdao. The ensuing fight ended in an Allied victory after British and Japanese troops assaulted the city. Similarly, to the south and east, Australia and Japan scrambled to pick up German colonies that were scattered across the South Pacific. The South Pacific War later became known as the Neglected War, even though it resulted in a number of momentous invasions, including the Australian occupation of Papua New Guinea. The tank is such a ubiquitous vehicle in modern warfare that it'd be easy to assume its invention turned the tide of the First World War.
Fall down! Get down!
But it didn't. At times, tanks were used to great effect, able to cross no man's land and roll over barbed wire. However, many early experiments using tanks were also pretty laughable, and they by no means secured the Allies' victory. The first use of British tanks during the war occurred during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, one of Britain's most disastrous engagements. The Allies arguably won a Pyrrhic victory following terrible losses, but the tanks didn't provide much help. These early tanks were extremely slow, meaning men could easily outrun them, and they could be dispatched with a well-aimed shot to the fuel tank. The tank rapidly improved over the course of the war, and they eventually helped to win a few battles, such as the Battle of Cambrai in 1917. But to say they won the war for the Allies would be quite untrue. You probably know the story. On Christmas Day 1914, British and German troops left their trenches to celebrate Christmas and enjoy an impromptu game of football. Sadly, it's something of a half-truth. The myth that the British soldiers left trenches en masse to meet and play with the Germans emerged due to gossip that spread among soldiers in 1914. Although these rumors were largely unsubstantiated, many stories were printed in various newspapers secondhand. In fact, there is more substantial evidence of instances in which the Brits asked the Germans to play and the Germans said no. One soldier wrote in his letters that his unit asked the Germans to send a team over to play, but Either they considered the ground too hard as it was freezing all night and was a plowed field, or else their officers put the bar up. On the upside, the rest of what you've heard about the truce is true. British and German soldiers really did meet up on Christmas Day to shake hands, exchange souvenirs, and take photographs together. They just didn't spend a lot of time playing football. Roughly 20 million people were killed in World War I. An additional 21 million people were injured and countless more traumatized. However, despite popular belief to the contrary, it was not the deadliest war in history at that time. Prior to World War II, the deadliest war in history took place in China. China's enormous size, coupled with its history of civil strife, had resulted in some staggering death tolls throughout history. For example, the Taiping Rebellion, which took place in the 19th century, claimed somewhere between 20 and 70 million lives, depending on which estimates you trust. That conflict split China in half and carried on for 14 agonizing years. Elsewhere, the An-Lushan Rebellion in 8th century China supposedly took around 36 million lives in just 8 years. Both wars matched or surpassed the death toll of the First World War, and they did it without any mechanized weapons.